To me, what I'm seeing in society is friends who are not able to talk to each other anymore. I think about my mom's friends in the 70s and 80s, and if one of them was mad, they would just say, "That really hurt my feelings. How could you do that?"
Mm-hmm.
And now today we can't say that for some reason. We will just cut the person off. We will say they are toxic, and we'll never say, "Hey, I should have said this about 50 times ago, but you really hurt my feelings," and you keep doing it. But for some reason, we can't have these conversations, and I don't know why. And so I did want to look at Mary Louise and Lily and have someone talk about the importance of communicating before this anger and resentment or jealousy or whatever it is builds up inside you and you do something that you can't take back.
Welcome to Book Reporter Talks To, where our latest guest today is Janet Skeslien Charles. And we're going to be talking about her wonderful historic novel, The Paris Library, which is a Book Reporter bets on selection. So welcome, Janet. It's so nice to see you again. It was, I guess, a year ago, January, that I saw you last, and then like a pandemic got in the middle.
Yes, we were in a busy ballroom having fun, and yes, and then everything changed. You're absolutely right. Yes, and thank you for having me on the show. It's a delight.
Was such a pleasure to be able to pick up the conversation that we first started. I remember we shot a little short preview video of you for our readers that were talking about this book that was coming in May. So I just need to tell all the readers that I didn't miss something. The book got held, and the book is coming out in February 2021 because they didn't want to be releasing it in the middle of a pandemic. So all of you who heard me talking about this book last year, I just want you to know we didn't forget to review it. We didn't forget to interview Janet. That's what's been going on. So I've been looking for picking up the conversation. So let's start a little bit with you telling us about the Paris Library. Just tell us about this book and how it came to be.
Well, I worked at the American Library in Paris, and that's where I heard the incredible true story of the librarians who defied the Nazis in order to hand deliver books to Jewish readers. So I just was inspired by that story. It gave me chills. Later on, I read a report marked confidential from the director of the library, Dorothy Reeder. And I got chills just reading her 15-page report about life during the occupation, and I knew it was a novel, and I just had to sit down and write it.
Now, how did you get to Paris? So what drew you to Paris at the very beginning, and how did you get that job at the library? Those are the two things I've got to start with, because that's where you found the story. But let's start with, you grew up in Montana, and we'll get to that later, but you got to Montana to Paris. How did that happen?
Well, I've been thinking about this book since I was 10 years old because I grew up next to a French war bride, and I have always admired her courage. She left behind her friends, her family, her country, even her language to start all over. She was from Rouen near the Normandy beaches. So that's where she met her GI husband. She came to Shelby, Montana, which is just a small dot on the map, population 2,000. And I just loved listening to her speak French. I wanted to hear stories about life in France. Her daughter and granddaughter spoke French, so it was just really exciting for me to be around something different, because at that time in the 80s, we did not have that much from the outside world. So that's where really my love of French started, and I eventually got a job after studying at the University of Montana as a teaching assistant in a local high school here. That was a job you could get, and the French government would provide your visa, so it was something that you were able to come here and work without problem. So that's how I came, as a teaching assistant, and then I met my husband, and I kept renewing that teaching assistant contract, and we got married. That's a long-term contract, and that's how that started. But and then eventually I got a job at the library.
So this one woman back in Montana all those years ago really influenced such a huge path for your life and your career at the same time, just by meeting her. And so did you major when you were in school? Did you major in French? Did you major in English? Were you always a writer?
I've always been a writer. Even when I was 12, I was a writer. Maybe now I'm an author, but writing is not what I do. It's who I am. And you can ask my husband, if I don't write, I get grumpy. So it's just something I need. And so, yes, I studied English at university with minors in French and Russian. And I've just always been interested in communication and in language.
So right now you're living in Paris.
Yes,
And
this is
how
my
long have you,
office in Paris. Yes, yes, I haven't been to the States since March of 2020. I haven't
and
been
normal,
anywhere since March of 2020.
now would you normally come back in between? Like, are you normally living in both Paris and Montana, or are you really based there and just come back to visit?
Well, for 25 years, I've been a school teacher. So I always had summers off, and maybe that was a strategic choice so that I could always go back to Montana in the summer. So I was very sad not to be able to go to Montana in 2020, but I just thought it was more responsible to not travel and just kind of try to stay home and help in my small way this situation, this pandemic. So yes, usually I would have gone home maybe twice a year.
So the job at the library, when you were there, you were actually working as a program director there. So what kind of programs were you offering at the library? Like what was the kind of thing you would do?
Well, the favorite program that I worked on as the programs manager was the Evenings with an Author series, where 1 to 2 nights a week we would invite authors, debut novelists, National Book Award winners, maybe art historians, maybe journalists. And I just love listening to people tell their stories. I love seeing the interaction with the audience. I was always in the back of the room with one eye on the audience, one eye on my notebook, taking notes, because I'm just fascinated with people and their stories.
So you're at the library and you're working there, you discover the story. Did you start writing right away, or did you do a lot more research before you decided to commit to doing it? I knew you've written another book. You had written a book before this. So was this book under contract, or was this something you were doing on spec, trying to figure out what to do next?
I heard that story and I wasn't sure if there was enough information out there, because I was told by a colleague who'd been there since the Nixon administration that they'd had a professional writer come in and evaluate the archives. And that professional writer had said, there's just not enough information.
Wow.
But that was before so many archives have been put online. For example, I received hundreds of pages from the American Library Association archives. They scanned the pages, sent them to me. That's where I found the 15-page report from Dorothy Reeder was online. And once I read that report, I knew that every day more things were being put online. There was access. So I felt confident about writing the book. But at first it was a little discouraging to hear, well, there's just not enough there.
Isn't that crazy the way the internet has opened up so many resources that were there all along, that now there's just about any topic you want to look up. You can just sit there and say, okay, this is what's happening with this. Or you can go down the rabbit hole like very, very easily. Do you find that sometimes you're too far down the rabbit hole? Like, when did you start writing? Did you have enough research done, or did you say, okay, I've got enough, let me get started now, and then continue to research?
I started with Lily's story in Montana, and I felt like I'd lived enough that I didn't have to do too much research. And it was the Cold War. I grew up in the 80s. We had those nuclear missiles that were planted like potatoes across our fields, and we drove by them like we drove by the church, like we drove by the school, like it was no big deal, not even giving it a second thought, which to me now is just insane. But so I wrote all of Lily's pages, which is probably, I don't know, 30% of the book. I started writing Lily's section first. The book takes place France, Montana, France, Montana, France, Montana. But what I did was I wrote Montana, and then I wrote France. And so I was able to write and research at the same time. And I went to the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, France's National Library, where they had pristine copies of the Paris edition of the New York Herald Tribune, papers from 1939, 1940, just gorgeous to look at. The advertisements for girdles and cigarettes right next to the announcement from the American ambassador telling all Americans to leave France now. It was very interesting to look at. And so it's true, there are rabbit holes in libraries because it's so interesting. I want to read everything. For example, one thing I found were all of these articles about the Duchess of Windsor. Oh, the Duchess of Windsor is giving out mittens to soldiers, or oh, the Duchess of Windsor is at the soup kitchen handing out soup. So that's not really the view we have of her. But it was really lovely to see these snippets of her life.
It was like pre-Instagram, pre-social media.
Very interesting. I looked at back issues of Library Journal to see what librarians were concerned about in the 1940s, to see if they had the same concerns as today. And strangely, germ transmission through books was one of them. I thought worry about germs was fairly recent, but no, even in the 40s. So it was very interesting, and it's true I had trouble stopping.
Yeah, I would bet. So you're writing the entire character of Lily. You've got her whole story arc of what's going on with Lily, which, and now I'm understanding why you started in 1983. Was that 1983 is the setting, and it's because you understood that time frame. So did you want to leave Montana as badly as Lily did? Were you like ready to like pack my bags? I know French. Put me on an airplane.
Oh yes, I wanted out. I wanted out. But I started in 1983 because I wanted situation in Montana to echo the situation in France. So I started with a dark moment in the Cold War when the Soviets shot down a passenger plane going from Anchorage, Alaska to Seoul, Korea. And so throughout the times in the books, the political situation in the two eras resemble each other, and we end on a positive note in both eras as well.
Yeah, but it's the two different, now I'm seeing the two different paths, and I wasn't seeing that before. So very, very interesting, because what you're actually doing is telling two stories at once. It's like, this is where we were, but this is where we are, and this is where the troubles haven't ended. In other words, the troubles, if we could sit there and say, like, we're talking about the Irish times, the troubles, you know? When Odile is based on this real person, and is that actually her name? Was that her name as well?
Well, Odile, physically, I based her on a bookseller named Odile Hellier, who had a shop of English books and American books on Princess Street, Rue Princesse, called The Village Voice. And she just was such a great support to me. She always had my book on her tables, and I just always appreciated her love of English, her interest in the outside world. She started her bookstore at the age of 40. She retired at the age of 70, and is so energetic and just a pure love of Anglophone literature. So I thought about her a lot, but my character is not based on her or her family. Her father was a resistant in Strasbourg, whereas, as you know, my Odile's father has a very dark history.
Yeah, really dark history. And what's going on with her relationship with him? And she has a twin brother. She has a brother that she idolizes, that she sees such a part of his life. He runs to war. Let's say he runs to war. He doesn't sign up to war. He runs to war, sort of running away from their father. And there's so many layers on this story about the family relationship, besides what's happening in the outside world. You know, a lot of times when we're thinking about things that happened in World War II, we're forgetting that people ate breakfast, they ate lunch, or they didn't because there wasn't enough food. Or we hear just about the not food, but we don't understand the squabblings within the family, or the things that drive people to do different things. And I think that you really wrote in your book about this rich family history that sort of drove the whole family in these different directions, and what her father was actually doing. And you're taught to be reverent about your parents. You're taught that everything your parents do is right. And she just starts having these questioning moments. What was it like writing that?
Well, it was very dark because I did a lot of the research in France's Holocaust Museum. So seeing those letters, they were inspired by actual letters that I saw. So that was really, it was very hard to write. It was very hard to look at that part of humanity, and it was very challenging to think about what kind of person would do these kinds of things.
Mhm.
But I tried to show also that he was a man with a family, and he was told very clearly, if you don't do it, someone else will. And he was thinking about his family. He wasn't thinking about all those other families.
Yeah. And the way people were constantly spying on each other, no one felt safe because you didn't know, even if you weren't doing something wrong, could it be interpreted the wrong way? And I think that a lot of times when I was reading your pages, you could feel the fear amongst people of, I'm being followed. One of the things the librarians are doing, to get back to the Paris library portion of the book, is the librarians are actually trying to smuggle books out to those who are no longer able to come to the library. And let's talk a little bit about, like, that was a huge mission of these people. Were many caught? Were many, arrested as of what they were doing, or how easy was it really to hide?
Well, it was very challenging because, of course, they had to go through those barriers, and there were always questions about what they were doing, and there was always a fear because, as you said, uh, the rules were changing every day. So what was okay today might not be okay tomorrow. So they just never knew. And things like listening to the BBC was illegal.
Hmm.
So even simple things that we take for granted were illegal. For example, the library was threatened to be denounced by a patron who just got tired of waiting in line to check out books.
Yes.
She
Yeah.
tried to cut ahead in line. Another time, one of the librarians had to go to the office of the Nazi library protector because the library had been denounced because it had German caricatures in its collection. So it was a very dangerous time, and having the wrong things and having the wrong reading material in your hands could get you in serious trouble.
And also what was interpreted as the wrong reading material. It's not just the things that we would normally think about. It would be, you would have a German, which was something that was anti-German in your stacks. No, it was much deeper than that.
Mhm.
And it was things that had been in the library for a very long time, but people were constantly, I felt like when I was reading, looking for things that they could report, looking for things that they could do to undermine others and hurt them. And when you're on the street and you're carrying things to a Jewish reader, that you're going to bring them documents or whatever, at any moment, you don't know if you're going to be stopped. Will you be able to pull it off or whatever? Could you have ever done what Odile did? I was trying to think if I could have done it. I'm not sure.
Honestly, I thought 2 years ago, well, many years ago when I was writing this book, I thought Dorothy Reader was crazy. When the American ambassador tells you to leave France, you leave France. So I always thought these librarians were crazy, but I was in the States in 2020 in March, and I had the choice between staying in the States or coming back to France, and I chose to come back to France. So I don't know what I would have done. What I thought I would have done turned out to be not so true. I don't think until we're in that position we can really say what we would or would not do. We hope we would, but
Yeah,
do we
and it's
know?
interesting right now too, because there are rules. You should wear a mask, you should do this, you should do that. And when it's not happening, people are very quick to report others of what they didn't do. I mean, if you're on social media right now and you make a misstep, it's like augmented of they didn't do this, they didn't do that. And this way, everybody was writing notes, they were writing letters of,
Mhm.
and I love the anonymous notes as I was reading of, these are all the things that this library has done wrong as infractions. And you're just like, who is this person that won't even sign this, but is reporting us all the time on what we've done? It's really scary. How long ago did you start writing the book? How long was that process?
I started writing the book in about 2010, and I started probably really seriously researching the French parts in 2012. That's when I
Wow.
had more free time.
Wow. And were you under contract to write this book, or was this like you wrote and then you submitted it?
No, I had a first contract with Bloomsbury US UK, and that was just for one book, and this book was just writing on spec and hoping for the best.
Well, I think the best happens. Let's put it that way. I think
Well,
that it's been so interesting to see people talking about the book and buzzing about the book. And there are a lot of parallels to what we're going through right now of, like, you can't get from here to there. You can't. And I think that if it had come out and we hadn't been through that, it would have been a different reading experience. But now you're realizing, oh, you can't go there, or you can't leave your home, or if you do, there's danger. And I don't think people were really thinking about that. If you had read this book last January, it was like, oh, it's a World War II story. It's not a story about it could happen to anybody.
well, and it's true. The book came out in France in October, and right afterwards, bookstores closed. And the title in French is A Thirst for Books and for Liberty. And it was at a time when people really wanted books, and the bookstores were closed, libraries were closed, and they wanted freedom. They were tired of wearing masks. They wanted to travel again. So that was very interesting to see. I spoke with my Spanish translator, who said that during lockdown, bookstores, um, bookstore owners would go to the supermarket, wait by the tomatoes, and then in a clandestine way hand over books that customers had bought. So it really is interesting to see what happens around books when we don't have access to them like we usually would.
Yeah, we don't have access. And it's like, is it like, okay, a year ago, curbside pickup. What was curbside pickup? Like, who had heard that phrase? And who had heard that, like, you can't go to the library today for any of your programs? They're all going to be on Zoom. I mean, just think about you and I trying to do this last year. You would have had to be in the office all the time. You would have had to have line. Meanwhile, you're in Paris. It's 5 hours later than what it is for me. We're having the conversation, and you can pick up and do an entire book tour, not moving that office right there, which is probably not as glamorous as book tour would normally be. But you also haven't missed a flight. Like, you haven't missed any planes.
No, and I'm in my pajama bottoms. So it all works out.
It all works out. I was watching an author the other night, and she was wearing flip-flops and the other person was wearing slippers. And it was really pretty funny. I do say that I do put on shoes before I do these interviews. It's the one thing I do, is I always put on shoes. And I don't know why, but shoes is something that I'm always thinking of doing. So what was your favorite character to write? I was trying to figure out which one, when you delved into it, was it Odile, was it Lily, or somebody else?
Of course, I loved the real life librarians, especially Miss Reader, but I loved Margaret the most because, she is a foreigner, and like a lot of people who come to Paris, they have these high expectations of the city and all of the glamour and all of the perfume, the champagne, the romantic Frenchman, and sometimes reality is quite different. And so I have a soft spot for Margaret.
And she had a tough time of it. She really, really had a tough time with some of the decisions she made along the way before we meet her as a character, along the way, and then bears a terrible price in a lot of ways for things that she's done, and a very, very public price. I'm not giving anything away, but I will say was when you're reading her, you will, definitely see that. You reached out to families, the people who knew the families from the library. What was that like? What were those conversations like?
I think they were a little surprised because I would use the white pages and just randomly phone. And I was lucky because I had, there were names like Thickweiler and Frickert and Nechayev, which were easier to find. I also had Turnbulls, and they were Canadian. It was a Canadian mother-daughter team. And they were a lot harder to track down, unfortunately, because there are more Turnbulls than there are Fickweilers. So I especially loved talking to Boris's children, who are in their 80s now, and learning about their father. It was very interesting because when they spoke about him, it was like each one was talking about a completely different man. And throughout our conversation, they would turn to each other as they spoke, and one would say, "I didn't know that," or I never heard that. Or so it was very interesting. And I think the nicest review I could ever receive was from Boris's son, who said even though the book was 400 pages and in English, he read it in 4 days, and that I had succeeded in capturing the spirit of his father and the library. Both children had spent time in the library, so that was really nice to have too, that background in the library.
Oh, that is so wonderful to get a compliment like that from somebody who was there, boots on the ground, and the way you portrayed their father. The choices that are made by some of the characters will alter their lives. Did you think of those in advance, or did you plot this book out first? Or as you were writing, were the characters coming to you? I always love when authors say that the character told me what to do. I'm kind of wishing I had some characters telling me what to do all day long, because I'm kind of making it up on my own, So the character's telling you, or are you doing it yourself?
Character surprised me. Of course, I knew Odile. I wanted to write about a war bride, so I knew something had to happen to launch Odile from Paris to Montana. And in books, not too many happy things can happen because there's no dramatic tension to keep the reader moving along. So I knew something pretty bad would have to happen, but it was only as I went on that the characters surprised me, and I learned what they did and how they reacted. And I have to say, for the first 5 drafts, Odile died at the end.
Wow.
So when she ended up resuscitating herself, I was really surprised, happy.
Now, what did that require? The rescue squad, or what had to happen? But it is, it's like, okay, this is what I think is going to happen to her, and it doesn't. And like I said, we can't give away, because as much as this book is historical fiction, there are so many twists and turns along the way that you just don't want to divulge for the reader to actually have that wonderful experience. But what happened with her was surprising to me. I mean, I knew that there was a twist because I read the about the book copy. So I knew there was, but I didn't think that was what it was going to be. I knew there was, something that happened and it was a big deal, but I didn't think that she was going to be the one that it happened to. And that was a big reveal along the way. The book has romance, friendship, and family. And did you always know you want to do the blend of those three things? Because there are three, you handle the romance, you handle the friendships, and you handle family, and you also handle so well the young women who are in conflict with each other. Like, I'm not going to speak to her. I'm not going to do this petulant kind of a thing that the Lily and her friend are going through. Was it always planned like that, or was it going to be this more dramatic book about the library itself?
Well, to me, what I'm seeing in society is friends who are not able to talk to each other anymore. I think about my mom's friends in the 70s and 80s, and if one of them was mad, they would just say, "That really hurt my feelings. How could you do that?" Mm-hmm. And now today, we can't say that for some reason. We will just cut the person off. We will say they're toxic, and we'll never say, "Hey, I should have said this about 50 times ago, but you really hurt my feelings," and you keep doing it. But for some reason, we can't have these conversations, and I don't know why. And so I did want to look at Mary Louise and Lily and have someone talk about the importance of communicating before this anger and resentment or jealousy or whatever it is builds up inside you, and you do something that you can't take back, or you ruin the friendship, or you end the friendship when the other person has no idea why. I think that's a real pity.
Yeah, and I was also thinking of Odile with her brother's girlfriend. It's Bitsy was her name, and all of a sudden you got a note from my brother. I didn't get a note from my brother. I'm not going to speak to her. And the person at the library is going, like, just bury it. Like, just this is your best friend. You need to make this change. And it is the way those things can fester and really unravel a really long friendship and really a relationship. And if somebody's not wise enough to say, what are you really doing here? It becomes an issue,
It really does. And it's at a certain point, at a certain age, you like to think we can have that, be able to take that step back and look at our own behavior and be able to communicate a little bit better. But I'm not sure we do.
No, and it was even with, older people. It's like, well, I can't just sit there and say that, this is what I feel about it. Even when Odile is not talking to Margaret about how she really feels about the things that Margaret's doing. And Margaret's helping her in a lot of ways, but she resents what Margaret's actions are. And there's this real push and pull of right and wrong that we're sitting and looking at. And it's not as black and white as people want to see. And I think that this book is bringing up so much about nuance being really important to what people are doing. It's not, you did this and I did that. And I don't know. I just felt that there was a lot about human emotion and the way people work with each other that was beautifully woven into the story as well.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, it was, okay. So saving face is something that comes up and again, making sure that people see you a certain way that leads to many choices. And some of them are not good ones, but it's the way you appear to outside in the world. And I think that for years, that's been a very big thing with people I always joke on social media that everybody's children are so well behaved, no one ever cries. Everybody puts up a very, very different image of themselves. Whereas this used to be, you leave the house dressed a certain way, you behave a certain way, and as a result, certain things come your way. Was that something that you were juggling a lot when you were writing, is appearance and the face of who people are?
Well, of course, in Paris, that's all that matters. And there have been this year and last year, there have been 2 books written by women. One was a memoir about a girl who was groomed at 14 by a very famous French author. And, I think she wrote the book when she was nearly 40 because of appearances. And everyone knew what he was doing, but no one no one would say anything. And just recently, another book by a young French woman was published about incest in her family. And she, again, came from one of these big, they call them grande famille, important families. And so there's a real problem there when the appearance becomes more important than what's going on behind that facade. And that happens a lot in Paris. I mean, you can see with the fashion shows, with the fashion, so much is about appearances. So much is about looking good. It doesn't really matter how people feel as long as they look good. And that, so I did hope that that theme carried through the book.
Yeah. Yeah, it completely came through because it was, well, if you leave the house like that, what people will think, and you can't have them saying this. Even her mother didn't want her to be with a policeman boyfriend. No, you cannot be alone together. What people will think and what people will say about you. And she was like, she couldn't make very many decisions because it was, what will my mother think? What will my father think? And then when she finds out some things her father is doing, it's sort of like, well, wait a second, I'm listening to him for advice about my life, but what is he doing over here? And her views of him change as well. So very, very multi-layered when it comes down to that. You also had this wonderful passage about grief. And I'm actually going to read this. And it was, grief is a sea made of your own tears. Salty swells cover the dark depths you must swim at your own pace. It takes time to build stamina. Some days my arms sluiced through the water and I felt that I would be okay. The shore wasn't too far off. And then one memory, one moment would nearly drown me, and I'd be back to the beginning, fighting to stay above the waves, exhausted, sinking in my own sorrow. So powerful. Was there something that drove you when you were writing those lines, besides thinking about the characters, grief that you've known, that you could actually write so beautifully about what it would feel like?
Yeah, I think we've all had our hearts broken, and I think we've all experienced loss, especially this year. And that the book came out in 4 or 5 other countries before it came out in the States. And so I see online the sections of the book that people quote, and that's the section that in Italy and France, in Serbia and Romania, people have quoted the most. And I have to give credit to Trish Todd at Atria, my editor, because the section that I wrote of that was very specific to Lily. And there was more about Lily's personal feelings in that. And so when Trish and I were going through the book, she wisely recommended that we remove those sections that were more about Lily. And she was absolutely right. I mean, that's what having a great editor will do for you. It will really make your prose shine.
Yeah, Trish will challenge you. Trish will absolutely challenge you. And it is so strong. And it's interesting to hear that other people have picked up, that as well. Yeah, I mean, I went back, and it's funny because I was reading the book and I was doing that thing that people never should do, is dog ear all the pages. Like, these are the pristine copies. I have copies that have many pages folded down. And I was going through last night, and when I do that, when I mark them, this is interesting, I don't underline, I just fold down the page. And when I go back, I read the whole page to try to figure out what was the thing that I was going to, because if you're reading something back here, when you get to this part of the book, you may see something different. So as a result, maybe the thing that I read didn't really matter, because at the time it mattered in the story. But that phrase, when I back and read it yesterday, I typed the whole thing last night into my notes. And I said, I just think that phrase, that whole section really resonated. And when I looked at the page, I immediately knew that was what I had reached onto, because I think you understood then what she was feeling and how every day might change of the way you're going to feel. And I can see that I will be quoting from that one, in many a sympathy note later on, because it is so dead on about the way people feel. On a different note, wait a second, I do have to ask, do you think that you would have been brave enough to carry the books? Would you have carried the books? Would you have done that?
I'd like to think I would have, but again, I don't think we ever know until we're in that position. I don't think so.
Know.
Going back to what you said about underlining, I love underlining in books, and I love buying secondhand books that people have underlined, because when I read a book 10 years later, 20 years later, and I go back to it, it's interesting to see what my younger self valued. And then when I reread it, I use a different color pen.
Oh,
And
okay.
it's really fun to see what jumps out at me the next time when I'm a little older and hopefully a little wiser or looking at things in a different way.
Well, it's funny because right now I'm watching a lot of author pre-publication tour interviews. And I usually have the ARC, the advanced reading copy of the book next to me, and I'm writing the notes right in the ARC so that I don't lose them because there's paper all around this office. So I write, and I just learned this, believe me, this is not something I did like back in March. I learned this about a month ago. And then you always know where the notes are because they're right inside the book. I don't have to go look for them. And I thought, if I ever loan this ARC to anybody to read, like family members, so they're going to sit there and go, what is all of this inside? And it's just random things that I'm hearing them saying. And it might be a quick line that they said that was a joke, but I'll just throw it down there. And I said, boy, reading my notes later on of like, what was she thinking? And the folded down pages of like, why did she fold down all of these pages? And like I said, sometimes when you go back and look, you've already got your answer. So you don't need to be asking that question anymore because it unfolds later. But sometimes you're, okay, I completely know, like, this is why I went and did this. One of the things I folded down was the Dewey Decimal System that's quoted throughout the book. And I just love that because she would hear somebody's name or she'd hear something and immediately categorize them. Did I read that the numbers that we know today were not the same as back then? Did I read that correctly?
Yes, because the Dewey Decimal System has been revised several times, to add things like computers or internet. So it's been revised several times. I did not go back to 1939 to see what numbers might have been used. But I did ask Simon Gallo, who has been the collection manager since the Nixon administration, and he did the numbers for me. So that was really kind. And one thing he pointed out was that each library might have slightly different numbers, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, it's those things you don't think about. And we started this company in 1995, 1996, when there was no internet. Like there was an internet, but it was like AOL, and it wasn't really what people were thinking about doing. And you realize how much things have changed since then. Of yes, you'd go to the library and do research on something that would take like 25 minutes to log on, and it'd be black and white. And I actually confess that in my closet, I still have all my old laptops. I have my old one from when I was at Condé Nast, and I booted it up. It actually turned on, which was like really surprising. And it was black and white, and it had expense reports of like, how to do your expense reports and all these little things and all these floppy disks that we used to put in. And I don't know. It's just funny because you realize it hasn't been that long, but how drastically the world has changed. And the author, being an author, I was listening to an interview with an author before. It used to be you wrote the book, you turn the book in, you go out and do this book tour. That was kind of it. And when we first started, the back of the book, your copy would have said, Janet lives with her husband in Paris and she visits Montana in the summer and like she has a dog or a cat. That's all we would ever know. We wouldn't know what she liked to read. We wouldn't see what her home looked like. We wouldn't know what she cooked for dinner. Like we wouldn't know any of these things. And even from the time you wrote your first book to now, what has changed about you being an author? Because the social media was not what it was when you wrote your first book.
No, I think it was just beginning. They told me to get on Twitter and Facebook. I don't know that Instagram was there yet. It was in 2009. I wasn't on Instagram. I might be the last person on earth to have joined. I do enjoy it. And I have to say, I am so in awe of the Instagrammers or Bookstagrammers who do such beautiful posts, both the words, both their reviews and their photos. They are so talented. And I can see a future as writers in many of them because they have an eye, they have talent, so it's very interesting to see the change in social media. And I know here in France for my book, the social media campaign on Instagram, I think it's been really lovely to see and kind of important. And I think it is important because for newspapers we have shrinking review pages. So in some ways social media has helped people get the word out about the book. I think it's also forced newspapers to kind of open their view of different books as well. I saw David Leibowitz was talking about writing about Paris, and until his blog, you never heard about the outer districts of Paris. It was always just kind of the inner hub where Hemingway was. So I think it's good.
It's a much bigger city. And I agree with you. I confess that I'm terrible at taking pictures. I basically put, this is the book I'm reading. I don't have time to like dress it up. I mean, every once in a while I'll put a stack by the pool and I'll go, these are the ones I'm going to read without the covers. And then cleverly, a few weeks later, I say, these are the ones I read. It's like, you know, some reveal or something like that. But no, I confess I'm doing a lot more writing than I am, but I just look at some of the photos that people have done. And I think it's the reason galleys are so important, because people are doing this pre-pub to be promoting a book. And it's just the visuals are just such, you know, really, really lovely. So towards the beginning of the book, Odile wonders what kind of a reader Miss Reader is. So what kind of a reader are you? Are you eclectic? Are you thoughtful? What are you, what kind of a reader?
I cannot read without a pen in my hand. I usually don't have a bookmark, so I lay the book flat, which is not good for the book. I'm usually reading 4 to 5 books at the same time. And yes, I am just not faithful. I'm just here and there and everywhere reading a lot of different books at the same time. And I read everything. I love mysteries. I love nonfiction. I love novels. So I just read everything.
And there's a mystery built into this, because you know that something's going to happen, but you don't know what, and you build tension. So it's clear that you read across genre. This is not just historical fiction. This is historical fiction with this mystery of, like, you know, what is going to happen, or the suspense that is constantly built into the pages, and the pacing is really dead on as a result. But 4 or 5 books at the same time, I absolutely, okay, I can do 2, maybe 3. And usually maybe something else on audio, but I can't be doing. And do you read print or do you read ebooks? Which one, or both?
I do both, but because I do like to underline, I do prefer the physical book. And I have to say, there was one book that I couldn't physically get here in France, so I got the ebook. And I did, you know, you can highlight things, and the highlights disappeared one day, and it made me so angry. It just
Wow.
made me so angry. So no, I'm more of a physical. I love the smell of books. I love the feel of books. If I can't get a book here in France, I would have downloaded it, but after the missing highlights, that just, no, it
No,
made me mad.
it's not going to work. Yeah, I don't read ebooks just because I spend so much time on screens that I will not relax if I'm sitting looking at a screen. There was one book I read over the summer, Shira LaPena's Thriller, because I knew I could read it in a day. And I knew that I'd interviewed her the year before. I knew we weren't going to do that. So either that or I couldn't do it, because I need all those notes. And it's funny because I started reading this, as I told you, last year, and I have folded down pages. And so I went back and I was rereading. I was looking at, oh, so that was what mattered to me last January. You know, this is what I was taking away. So I remember we were having dinner, and I don't like to have dinner with somebody unless I've read at least 50 pages. I prefer to have read the whole book, but that was a lot of pressure at that point. But to go back and look and say, oh, those are the same pages that were folded down, I would have done the same thing. Bravo. But yeah, that not being able to underline in the ebook, it's just not the same thing, especially when I'm reading for an interview. I mean, it's just not going to work. So it's good to know, because sometimes they'll say, we'll just send it to you. You could just underline. Well, I've heard they could go away, you know, now I'm going to need to pay attention to that. So I assume that this was always the title. It was always the Paris Library, or was there some other title?
It was The War Bride for at least 5 years, and there were at least 30 more pages set in Montana, including a chapter about Buck, or it was from Buck's point of view, looking at Odile and why he wanted to marry her, and why I think he proposed day 3.
Wow.
So, and why, and I loved writing Buck's point of view, but at a certain point I realized it wasn't the War Bride story that was the most important. It was the library story, so it became the Paris Library, but for the longest time it was the War Bride.
The War Bride. Interesting. You've had multiple narrators on this audiobook, and it's kind of interesting that I was saying that was listening to that, and that there are going to be different people all sharing the story. And I kind of like that, because it's like you're having the story read to you by all these different voices. Did you get any kind of a say in what happened with the voices on the audio?
They sent me samples of audio, but I don't really, I couldn't say, and I just prefer to let the editor choose. I thought, they have more experience than I do, and she knows what's what. So I think she made great choices.
Yeah, yeah, it's very, very powerful voices. So your first night novel, Moonlight in Odessa, was about a mail order bride. Okay, your
Yes.
second book is about a wartime bride. So
Yeah.
can you tell us what's next? Is there a bride involved?
I am interested in women's journeys. I'm interested in how women remake themselves in a foreign country. I am interested in culture shock, not just from country to country, but from small town to big city. And I think that's probably the most important theme in my book is how a woman defines who she is and defines what's important to her.
When you go back to Montana now, is there's a love of the land and love of the place? And is it different from the girl who couldn't wait to get out? Like, how do you feel when you go back now?
I think there were so many things that I didn't notice or appreciate. Like in Paris, I can't hold my hands out like this without bumping 20 people. Whereas in Montana, you have all the space and the time that you need, and people are just kinder and and a little more generous, a little more thoughtful. Which, you know, when you're living in a big city and people are rushing, it's normal. It's
Mhm.
normal. But even in New York City, if I had a question, I remember going into a store and I wanted directions to the New York Public Library, and the security guard got out his phone and Googled it for me. You know, so I don't know what it is about Paris sometimes. So so yes, I do. Even just the smell of Montana, it just smells so good. But when you're, you know, when you're 14, 15 and you've always lived with that, you don't really notice those things, or you don't think of them as a luxury like now I do.
Yeah, I remember I was listening to one interview that you've done, and they said it was city, city, and then a lot of empty land. City,
Mhm.
city, and a lot of empty land. And it was a very different place of growing up as opposed to a city, which is totally alive every single minute. We had an office in New York for many, many years, for 24 years. And I was always, if I left the office and then somebody didn't ask me for directions, and I remember one time was my favorite. Our office was up on 57th Street at the time, and it was I was leaving the parking garage on 56 to go to 57, and this family came around the corner, and it was the anniversary of the Statue of Liberty, and they all had those statue foam things on their heads, and they said, where's the statue? And I was like, okay, it's a subway ride or a bus ride or a cab ride. And they were just looking like they were going to come around that corner and the statue was always going to be there. And I've always been very wanting to help people if they're in the city, to give them directions. And sometimes somebody will just be standing there and I'll say, are you lost? And I'll go over, because I know that's been me in every other city I've been. It's like I get turned around, I have no sense of direction, get lost in San Francisco and be at the water 3 times and be not where I need to be. So it was just very funny because I'd see people and they wouldn't be speaking English, and I'd be trying to figure out what to do, and I'd be walking them to a bus stop, or I'd be walking them here, there, the other place. And they said, you know, there are other cities where that doesn't happen. People are far more rude, and you are from out of town and they don't care. So yeah, I completely see that and understood. And I haven't been to Montana. It's one of those places well, I can't say it's a bucket list. It's the one place I want to go. I want to go ski Big Sky. I want to go do that whole part of the country because I understand the land and seeing the land like that and seeing the sky and how different it must have been for Odile as a war bride to have moved to this place that was so deserted and so desolate. And you realize what she was running from as well. And it was really to sit there and say, I'm walking away from it all. I just have to do this because this is where my life went. And it's a very dramatic end to the book. It's very, very, it's the pace is built till then, but then you're reading and you're like, wow, I knew something was going to happen, but I wasn't sure this was going to be it. Did you always know that was going to be it, or did it come to you as you were writing?
I knew it would be something, and I knew that Buck's parents would not appreciate Odile, and I did a lot of research on mail order brides, and it was fascinating. And so often they had a hard time because when they went to the States, in the towns or cities where they lived, the people felt like the war bride had stolen one of the
Mm-hmm.
boys
Mm-hmm.
from maybe a hometown, you know, high school sweetheart. So a lot of times there was a lot of resentment. I read an interview with one war bride who never called her mother-in-law by her first name. It was always Mrs. James. And you just kind of think about that kind of cold or distant relationship, and it's really something. And
Well, yeah,
I
and you
grew up.
think that. I'm sorry, I've thought a couple of times about how many young men died, and as a result, how many single women happened as a result of that. So you could see how that feeling would happen in a town of, he was supposed to marry her, and now who did he bring home with her? And it's the girl from the and foreign was something that was not comfortable in America. Foreign was those other people. It wasn't just immigration in the Midwest. It was, who are you and why are you interloping?
Mhm. No, no, absolutely. And just, the stereotypes of French women at the time as being easy or not taking baths. It just was really, it was really hard for a lot of of course, there was a language barrier a lot of the times. So it was very challenging for those brides. And in my first book as well, Moonlight in Odessa, it's very hard for women to go from a big city like Paris or Moscow to a farming community in Montana or Wyoming, where they can't make friends, where they can't work in their fields. I met some email order brides where they lived in towns where the roads weren't even paved. So to go from Moscow to that, it's really a hardship. Even if you think, oh, I'd love some quiet, or oh, I'm sick of the traffic, you just would start to miss your city.
And when you read the end, you almost want to go back and read Odile's story again, because you realize that's how she got there. Like all the other things that happened to her along the way. And then how was she coping? Like, what ended up, because you understand her a lot better and the way her feelings were and why she might be standoffish to so many, but so embracing of this young girl, because she just saw, you're in a really tough place. Your mom dies really early in the book. It's not a spoiler to be giving that away. And then you're saddled with these two young brothers that, like, are you the babysitter for? And you've got a stepmom who's trying, but this young girl is really like afloat on what to do. And her mom, is taken from her, and she's looking for that same kind of security. And Odile is kind of bringing that to her. She's also showing her there's a way out. There's a way to leave here, and there's a way to go. And I think that's all she really wants to know at that point, is there's some kind of escape from the world I'm in.
Absolutely. Well, and thank you for saying that about the stepmother, because I think she really did try. She was just overwhelmed, and there was, just the expectations put on women at that time. It just was very, very hard.
Well, even if it's also the one man, I'm not going to give anything away, is having an affair, and he brings his mistress over to take care of the wife. I mean, so now your husband's mistress is in your house taking care of you, and you're trying to show yourself in your best light, but that's what ends up going on. I mean, completely crazy of, the things that were happening, but those were real relationships. That was really what's happening. And I did love when her mom takes her out to drive. I did absolutely love that. And she's trying to do those special things for her, but it's kind of, she is nowhere. She doesn't have that relationship with her dad. She doesn't have, and I think a lot of it is about fractured family relationships are so much a part of this book, because you've got a fractured family and you think the family's going to come together and be like this in crisis. And it's not, it's doing this. And I found that was really interesting, because you think that, okay, we're at war. Your brother's off to war and we're going to become closer. And instead, everybody sort of pulls unto themselves, and everybody has their own worries to think about. And I think that there's something that you write beautifully about emotion in this book, besides just writing the story about the library, of where these families all went. And it's very natural, instead of these very, I don't know, the social media phony things where everything's perfect. It's not all perfect. It's like, how do you fix it when it's not?
And maybe that's what's really hard about today, is the social media makes it look like everyone's doing so well. And, there's that happiness filter on all of these photos. At least before, I think we kind of suspected that people were suffering or having a hard time or couldn't communicate. But it's true. I think it's really hard, especially for teenagers, because you used to be able to escape from school and classmates. And now with social media, they're omnipresent. It just would be really hard.
Well, it's funny too, because there's also this other thing that's come down, and we talk about Paris. Everybody looked perfect. I mean, I worked at Condé Nast. People always sit there and say, well, "What do you think about?" I always think about what I'm going to wear. I mean, I always think about what I'm going to wear, and then the rest, like I'll write the speech on the plane, but I need to think about what I'm going to wear. And I think that a lot of these barriers have been broken down this year, because you think about it. Luxury, what's luxury? Luxury, what? Travel? You're not going. Luxury fashion? Why? Like luxury beauty products, okay, we'll kick those in. But I think that a lot has changed recently on the way people feel. And all of a sudden you've got every newscaster shooting at their house. Everybody's shot up and like, what kind of lighting do you have? What are the things that last February we wouldn't have been thinking about at all that now are the biggest deal? Is like, what's your background like? What are you going to be? But you're in people's homes, and there's one of the Food Network channels, and you're seeing everybody, they were cooking at their houses. I think their kids were holding the camera and shooting it. And I loved it because it wasn't fake. It wasn't that something got dropped. And I think that there's something about this time that's magical, because all of a sudden we've got to be real. And you can't put up all these pretenses, whatever. It's a very, very real time. And I think that's what's happening a lot as I was reading this book, is it's real. Like, this is really what's happening to these people. And there's this when you think about the Paris, the library, you're going to think of, oh, people in fabulous fashion swirling through. But there's this undercurrent of what's really going on every day. So that's not really a question. I guess it's just.
Well, thank you. Yes, no, thank you. That's exactly what I hoped for. That's exactly what I hoped the reader would take away. So thank you.
Yeah, so I don't feel like I have to dress up to go to that library the next time. I'm not going to sit there and wear my ball gown. Also, last year, I think there was a coincidence at the library. This book was coming out last year because it was the 100th anniversary of the library, if I remember correctly. So were there any celebrations before the pandemic hit, or was there nothing that was able to happen?
It was hard. In France, we had 2 confinements. So for the first confinement, the American Library was completely closed. And during the second confinement, they could do click and collect. And I talked to Audrey Chapuis, who is the director of the library, and she said that people checking out books, like the level was just about the same in normal times. So people were really checking out books. They were really coming to the library, and really, even if it was just a brief interaction on curbside click and collect, people just, I think, had a stronger appreciation for the library and for bookstores.
Yeah, it's funny, click and collect. Now, I haven't heard that term before. In the States, I haven't heard that. It was always curbside pickup. But click and collect, I like that. Click and then go collect it later. Good idea. Really, really good idea. Janet, it's been such a pleasure. I hope we get to see each other again soon.
Too. Thank you so much, Carol. It was just so lovely to see you again and to catch up. And I just appreciate your help.
And I'm so glad I finished the book. I am so glad. Readers, you'll be reading my Bets on copies soon. Janet, please go write something else. And you can't take 10 years because I need to read it sooner. Okay, so you just keep clicking away.
Thanks.
So thank you for joining us, and to our readers, thank you for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you next time.